The dust settled around Jake. Morrison's worn boots as he dismounted outside the Clearwater General Store. The autumn wind of 1885 carried the scent of sage across the Arizona territory. But it couldn't mask the tension that seemed to cling to this small frontier town like morning frost. Jake was a man carved from the harsh landscape itself, weathered face, lined with stories he'd never tell. Gray eyes that had seen too much, and hands scarred from years of ranch work and whatever darker. Business had brought him here. At 42, he'd been drifting for the better part of a decade, carrying ghosts that whispered his name in the quiet hours before dawn. The bell above the store's door chimed as he entered, and conversations died like snuffed candles. The store owner's wife clutched her shawl tighter. Sheriff Tom Bradley nodded curtly from behind a display of canned goods, his hand instinctively resting on his gun belt. "Morrison," Bradley acknowledged, his voice neutral but wary. "Sheriff." Jake's voice was gravelly from years of sparse conversation. He moved toward the back of the store where supplies were kept, but his attention was drawn to a small figure huddled in the corner. The girl couldn't have been more than 12. Her dark hair braided down her back, traditional Apache clothing. Dusty and torn, her bronze skin was streaked with tears, but her dark eyes held a defiance that reminded Jake of a cornered wildcat. She clutched a small leather pouch to her chest, likely all she had left in the world. "That's the Apache girl," Mrs. Henderson whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Found her wandering near the old Lawson place. Her people are all gone Calora. Took most of them last month. The survivors moved north." Jake studied the child. She stared back at him without flinching, reading his face with the intensity of someone who'd learned early that survival depended on understanding intentions. "What's your name?" he asked in halting Apache words, rusty from disuse. The girl's eyes widened slightly. "Ayana," she replied softly, then added in accented English, "It means eternal blossom. Pretty name." Jake crouched down to her level, his movements slow and non-threatening. "You got any family left, Ayana?" She shook her head, but her chin lifted proudly. "I can take care of myself." The store had gone completely silent. Jake could feel every eye boring into him, could sense the collective holding of breath. He'd seen that look before in other towns, other lives he'd left behind. The look that said outsiders weren't welcome, that difference was dangerous. "No child should have to take care of herself," he said, his voice carrying farther than he intended. He stood slowly, his decision crystallizing like winter ice. "Ayana, how would you feel about coming to live with me? I've got a small ranch outside town. Nothing fancy, but it's got 4 walls and a roof that doesn't leak much." The reaction was immediate and explosive. "Morrison, you can't be serious." Sheriff Bradley stepped forward, his face flushed. "That's an Apache child. Her people have been raiding settlements for. Her people are dead," Jake interrupted, his voice sharp as a blade. "She's 12 years old." Mrs. Henderson gasped audibly. "Mr. Morrison, surely you understand the complications. What will people think? What if she brings trouble?" Jake looked around the store, taking in every face, every expression of fear and disgust and small-minded hatred. These were the same looks he'd seen in Kansas before the war, in Colorado after it, in every town where fear masqueraded as righteousness. "What? I understand," he said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of too many regrets, "is that this child needs a home, and I'm offering her one." He looked down at Ayana, who had been watching the exchange with intelligent eyes. "What do you say, little one? Want to take a chance on an old cowboy?" For the first time since he'd seen her, she smiled, small and tentative, but real. "Yes, Mr. Morrison, I would like that very much." The murmurs started immediately, rippling through the store like wildfire. Jake ignored them all, purchasing the supplies he needed plus extra blankets, warm clothes in Ayana's size, and enough food for 2. As he worked, he was acutely aware of the conversations happening, just loud enough for him to hear. ... Never. Should have let him settle here. ... Bringing that savage into a Christian town. ... Mark my words, this will bring nothing but trouble. When they stepped outside, Ayana close to his side. Jake helped her up onto his horse, Ranger, a patient bay gelding who seemed to accept his new passenger without complaint. As they rode through town toward his ranch, Jake noticed how curtains twitched in windows, how people stepped back into doorways to avoid being seen. Mr. Morrison, Ayanna's voice was small against the wind. Yeah, they don't want me here. Jake was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with how to explain the inexplicable to a child who'd already lost everything. Sometimes, Ayanna people are afraid of what they don't understand. And when people are afraid, they don't always make good choices. Are you afraid of me? He turned to look at her, this small, brave girl who'd already shown more dignity than most of the adults in town. No, little one, I'm not afraid of you. In fact, I think you might be exactly what this old ranch needs. As they crested the hill, overlooking his modest spreada, small house, barn, and corral set against the backdrop of red rock mesas, Jake made a silent promise. Whatever came next, whatever price he'd have to pay for this decision, he wouldn't let this child face the world alone. Behind them, the town of Clearwater buzzed with outrage and speculation. By nightfall, every household would know that the strange Cowboy Morrison had taken in an Apache girl. By morning, the real trouble would begin. But for now, in the fading golden light of an Arizona sunset, a lonely man and an orphaned girl rode toward something that might, with time and courage, become home. 3 weeks after Ayanna came to live with Jake Morrison, Clearwater had made its feelings crystal clear. The first sign of trouble came when Jake rode into town for supplies and found the general store's door locked at midday. A hastily scrawled closed sign hanging crooked in the window. Mrs. Henderson's face appeared briefly behind the glass, met Jake's eyes, then quickly disappeared. He could see movement inside. Other customers who'd suddenly found the back room fascinating when he'd tied up Ranger outside. They're not going to serve you, Morrison. The voice belonged to Frank Dalton, a local rancher whose spread bordered Jake's to the east. Dalton stepped out from the saloon next door, flanked by 2 of his hands. Not while you're harboring that Apache brat. Jake turned slowly, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. Her name is Ayanna, and she's not a brat. She's a little girl who lost everything. She's a savage, Dalton spat, his face red with drink and righteous anger. And you bringing her here puts every decent family at risk. My wife won't even let our children play outside since you took her in. Your children are perfectly safe, Jake said quietly, but his gray eyes had gone cold as winter stone. Ayanna spends her days helping me with ranch work and learning to read. Last I checked, reading wasn't a threat to anyone. A small crowd had gathered, drawn by the raised voices. Jake recognized most of them people he'd tipped his hat to, done business with, treated with respect. Now they watched him like he'd become something dangerous, something to be feared. You think we're fools, Morrison. This from Mayor Hutchins, a soft man who'd never missed a meal or made a hard decision in his life. Everyone knows about Apache raids. That girl could be signaling to her people, telling them when we're vulnerable, her people are dead. Jake repeated, his patience wearing thin. She's 12 years old, orphaned, and trying to build a new life, just like some of you did when you came west. That's different, Mrs. Patterson called out from the crowd. We're civilized people. Jake's jaw tightened. Civilized people don't abandon children. The confrontation might have escalated, but Sheriff Bradley chose that moment to appear, pushing through the crowd with the weary expression of a man trying to keep the peace in an increasingly restless town. All right, break it up, he said, though his tone suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. Morrison, can I have a word? They moved away from the crowd, but not far enough to escape their watchful eyes and straining ears. Tom, you've known me for 2 years, Jake said before Bradley could speak. Have I ever been anything but straight with you? That's not the point, Jake. Bradley removed his hat, running his fingers through thinning hair. I've got a town full of scared people, and scared people do stupid things. Already had 3 families threaten to leave Clearwater if something isn't done about ... the situation. The situation has a name. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Bradley's voice carried genuine regret. Look, I know your heart's in the right place, but maybe the girl would be better off with her own people. There's a reservation up north where she'd be just another mouth to feed among strangers, Jake finished. Tom, that child has been through enough. She deserves a chance at a real home, a real family. At what cost? Bradley gestured toward the crowd, which had grown larger and more agitated. Half the town wants you both gone. The other half is Too scared to speak up? This isn't going to end well for anyone. Jake looked at the faces surrounding them, some openly hostile, others merely fearful, all of them closed to the possibility that a 12-year-old girl might deserve their compassion rather than their hatred. Then, I guess we'll find out what this town is really made of, he said. Back at the ranch, Ayanna was waiting on the porch, her dark eyes immediately taking in Jake's empty hands and grim expression. They wouldn't sell to you, she said. It wasn't a question. Jake sat heavily on the porch steps, suddenly feeling every one of his 42 years. No, little one, they wouldn't. Ayanna settled beside him, her small hands folded in her lap. For a long moment, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the desert sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. My grandmother used to tell me stories, she said finally, her voice soft but steady, about times when our people and yours lived in peace, traded together, helped each other through hard winters. What happened to those times? Fear, she said simply. Fear on both sides. People forgot that, underneath the different clothes and different languages, we all bleed the same red. We all love our families. We all want to be safe. Jake looked at her with new respect. You're pretty wise for 12 years old. When you lose everything, you learn quickly. She stood up, brushing dust from her skirt. Mr. Morrison, I don't want to bring trouble to you. If it would be better for me to leave, no. Jake's voice was firm. Final? Ayanna, I've spent the last 10 years running from one mistake or another, never staying anywhere long enough to call it home, but something about this place, about you. I'm tired of running. If this town wants a fight over doing what's right, then they'll get one. That night, as Jake checked the ranch's perimeter before bed, a habit, born of too many years in dangerous places, he found fresh horse tracks near the property line. Multiple riders, moving quietly, recently departed. He was being watched. Standing in the darkness, listening to the desert wind and the distant call of a coyote, Jake Morrison made peace with what was coming. He'd taken a stand, drawn a line in the sand, and there would be consequences. Inside the house, Ayanna slept peacefully in the small room he'd prepared for her, surrounded by the few possessions she'd managed to salvage from her old life and the new things he'd bought to make her feel welcome. She trusted him to keep her safe, to stand between her and a world that saw her as nothing more than a threat to be eliminated. He wouldn't let her down. Whatever the cost, whatever the town of Clearwater decided to do about it, he wouldn't let her down. The storm was coming. Jake could feel it in the wind, see it in the way the shadows seemed to gather just beyond the reach of lamplight. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new tests of just how far people would go when fear drove them to desperate measures. But tonight, for just a few more hours, a lonely cowboy and an orphaned girl could rest in the peace of a home, built on compassion rather than hatred. It might be the last peaceful night either of them would know for a very long time. The attack came on a Tuesday night in November, when the desert air carried the first bite of winter and the moon was nothing more than a silver crescent, barely visible through gathering storm. Clouds. Jake woke to the sound of rangers' agitated whinnying from the corral, followed immediately by the acrid smell of smoke. His hand found his gun before his eyes were fully open, instincts honed by years of sleeping light in dangerous places. Ayanna, he called, rolling out of bed and pulling on his pants in one fluid motion. She appeared in his doorway instantly, already dressed, her own survival instincts just as sharp. The barn, she said simply, and Jake could see the orange glow flickering through his bedroom window. They rushed outside to find the barn engulfed in flames, the dry wood and stored hay creating an inferno that lit up the night sky like a beacon. Jake's first thought was for the animals ranger, and the 2 other horses were safe in the corral. But the barn housed his milk cow, several chickens, and most importantly, the winter feed that would keep them all alive through the harsh months ahead. Help me get the animals out, he shouted over the roar of the flames, but as they approached the barn, rifle shots cracked through the night air, bullets whining past their heads and splintering the fence posts around them. Jake grabbed Ayanna and pulled her down behind the water trough. This wasn't random destruction, this was a coordinated attack designed to drive them off their land or worse. How many? Ayanna whispered, her voice steady despite the danger. Jake peered carefully around the edge of the trough, trying to spot muzzle flashes in the darkness. At least 4, maybe more. They've got us pinned down from the ridge. Another volley of shots sent splinters flying from the barn's frame. The attackers weren't trying to kill them, not yet. They were making a point, showing Jake what happened to those who didn't conform to the town's expectations. Mr. Morrison, Gianna's voice was urgent but controlled. "There's something you need to know about the ridge they're shooting from." Jake looked at her questioningly. "My people used to hunt in these hills. There's a box canyon behind that rig. If someone was to circle around through Devil's Draw, they could get behind them without being seen. Ayanna, I can't leave you here alone. You won't have to." Her dark eyes were determined. "Older than her 12 years, I know these hills better than they do. I can get to the ridge, create a distraction, give you time to flank them? Absolutely. Not, you're a child. And those men out there, those men want me gone," she interrupted, her voice carrying a quiet strength that reminded Jake she was more than just a frightened girl. "They're doing this because of me. Let me help end it." Before Jake could argue further, a new sound cut through the night, the thunder of approaching hooves. Sheriff Bradley's voice called out from the darkness, "Morrison, you and the girl come. Out with your hands up, we need to talk." Jake's blood ran cold. If Bradley was here, if the law itself had turned against them, then the situation was far worse than he'd imagined. "Sheriff," Jake called back, not moving from cover, "if you want to talk, tell your friends to stop shooting." "They're not my friends, Jake. But half the town is ready to ride out here with torches and rope if something isn't done tonight." Ayanna tugged at Jake's sleeve. "Mr. Morrison, look." She pointed toward the burning barn where the flames had revealed something that made Jake's stomach turn. Painted on the side of the structure in letters large enough to be seen from a distance were the words "Indian Lover" and "Apache Whore." The hatred wasn't just about fear anymore. It had become something uglier, more personal, more dangerous. "Sheriff Bradley," Ayanna called out, her young voice carrying clearly through the night air. "My name is Ayanna. I am 12 years old. I have never hurt anyone in this town. Why do they want to hurt me?" The shooting stopped. In the sudden silence, her words seemed to echo across the desert like an accusation. "Because they're scared, child," Bradley's voice came back, and Jake could hear the shame in it. "And scared people do terrible things. Mr. Morrison saved me when I had nothing," Ayanna continued, standing up despite Jake's attempts to pull her back down. "He gave me a home, taught me to read, treated me like family. If loving someone who needs love makes him bad, then what does that make all of you?" Jake watched in amazement as this small girl faced down armed men with nothing but the truth and a courage that put grown men to shame. In that moment, he understood something he'd been too blind to see before. This wasn't really about him at all. This was about what Ayanna represented, the possibility that the lines people drew between us and them were nothing more than fear and ignorance. She was living proof that compassion could bridge any divide, that family was about choice rather than blood. "Sheriff," Jake called out, "I'm coming out to talk, but I want your word that no one will hurt the girl while we're talking." "You have it, Jake." Jake emerged from behind the trough, his hands visible but ready to go for his gun at the first sign of treachery. Sheriff Bradley rode forward slowly, his face grim in the firelight. "This has gone too far, Tom," Jake said quietly. "I know." Bradley's voice was heavy with regret. "But Dalton and his boys are talking about taking matters into their own hands. If you don't leave town tonight, they say the girl's dangerous, that she'll bring her people down on us. Her people are dead. I know that. You know that. But fear doesn't listen to reason, Jake." From the darkness, one of the hidden gunmen called out, "Enough talking. Morrison, you've got 1 hour to pack up and get out of Clearwater. Take your pet savage with you." Jake's hand moved toward his gun, but Ayanna stepped forward, placing herself between him and the voice in the darkness. "I'll go," she said simply. "I'll leave tonight. Mr. Morrison doesn't deserve this trouble because of me." "No," Jake's voice was steel. "This is your home now, Ayanna, and no one is driving you away from it." As if to punctuate his words, the wind shifted, carrying with it a sound that made everyone freeze. From somewhere in the distance came the low, rhythmic beating of drums. But these weren't Apache war drums. Jake knew that sound from his time, and the cavalry knew it from too many nights spent around army campfires listening to soldiers' stories. These were the drums of mourning, and they were getting closer. The drumming stopped just as the first light of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. The burned-out shell of Jake's barn stood like a blackened skeleton against the morning light. Smoke still rising from the smoldering remains, Jake and Ayanna had spent the night in an uneasy standoff with the townspeople, Sheriff Bradley mediating an increasingly tense situation, while armed men remained hidden in the rocks above. As the hours passed, more people had arrived from town, some curious, some afraid, some openly hostile. What were those drums about, girl? Frank Dalton had emerged from the rocks at sunrise, his rifle still in his hands but pointed downward. His face showed the strain of a sleepless night, and perhaps something else, a growing uncertainty about the righteousness of his cause. Ayanna stood on Jake's porch, her small figure dignified despite her torn dress and soot-stained face. "Those were mourning drums," she said quietly. "Someone is grieving." "Grieving for who?" Sheriff Bradley asked, before Ayanna could answer. Young Tommy Henderson came racing up the trail on his pony, his face flushed with exertion and fear. "Sheriff, you gotta come quick." Bradley caught the boy's reins as he slid to a stop. "Slow down, Tommy. What's wrong?" "It's the Lawson place, and the Miller Ranch, and the Petersons. They're all sick, Sheriff. Real sick. Doc says it might be cholera." The word hit the gathered crowd like a physical blow. Cholera was a killer, sweeping through frontier towns like wildfire, sparing no one. Jake had seen whole settlements wiped out by the disease. How many sick? Bradley demanded. "Dozens, and it's spreading fast." "Doc says ... Tommy's voice broke. "Doc says he doesn't know how to stop it." The crowd began to murmur, fear replacing hostility as people suddenly remembered that they had families to protect, children who could die just as easily as they could hate. "We need to get back to town," Mrs. Patterson said, her earlier venom replaced by maternal worry. "My children, wait." Ayanna's voice cut through the rising panic, clear and commanding despite her youth. Every eye turned to her. "I may be able to help." Dalton laughed harshly. "Help? You're just I'm Apache," she said with quiet pride. "My grandmother was a medicine woman. She taught me about healing plants, about treating the water sickness." Water sickness? Dr. Reynolds had arrived with the dawn, his medical bag in hand and exhaustion written across his weathered face. "What do you know about cholera, child?" Ayanna looked at Jake, who nodded encouragingly. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. "My grandmother called it the white man's water sickness because it came from bad water, dirty water. She taught me that certain plants, prepared in certain ways, could help the body fight it. Willow bark for the fever, desert sage for the stomach pain," and she paused, her young face concentrating. "Prickly pear cactus, prepared with specific roots to help the body hold water." Dr. Reynolds studied her with new interest. "That's actually consistent with some modern medical theories. The tannins in willow bark do reduce fever, and keeping patients hydrated is crucial for survival." "You can't be serious," Dalton protested. "You're going to trust the medical advice of a savage child." "That savage child," Dr. Reynolds said sharply, "may know more about treating cholera than I do. I've lost 12 patients in the last 2 days, and nothing I'm doing is working." Sheriff Bradley stepped forward. "Ayanna, are you saying you can help our people?" "I can try," she said simply, "but I'll need to gather the right plants, and I'll need people to help me prepare them. It will take time," and she looked directly at the men who had been shooting at her just hours before. "It will require trust." The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Here was the moment of truth would the people of Clearwater accept help from the child they'd tried to drive away? "I'll help," Jake said immediately. "And I will too," Dr. Reynolds added. "If there's even a chance this could save lives." ... One by one, others began to speak up. Mrs. Henderson, thinking of her own grandchildren. Sheriff Bradley, sworn to protect the people of Clearwater. Even some of Dalton's own men began to shift uncomfortably, remembering that they too had families in town. "This is insane," Dalton muttered, but his protest lacked conviction. "Frank," Jake said quietly, "your own daughter Sarah is only 10 years old. If she were to get sick... Dalton's face went pale. "You leave my family out of this, Morrison. Your family is already in this," Ayanna said gently. "All our families are. Sickness doesn't care about the color of our skin or the language we Speak It just cares about finding people to hurt. By mid-morning, an unlikely group had assembled in the hills around Clearwater. Ayanna led them to specific locations where the medicinal plants grew, explaining in her careful English how each one should be harvested, how they should be prepared, how they worked together to fight the disease. Jake watched in amazement as this 12-year-old girl transformed from hated outsider to respected teacher. She moved through the desert landscape with the confidence of someone born to it, identifying plants that looked identical to untrained eyes, explaining the difference between healing and poison with the precision of a born healer. "How do you remember all this?" Dr. Reynolds asked, as Ayanna showed him the proper way to prepare willow bark tea. "My grandmother made me practice every day," she replied, her hands steady as she worked. She said knowledge was like water in the desert. It could save your life, but only if you knew where to find it and how to use it. As they worked, people began to talk for the first time since Ayanna had come to Clearwater. They learned that she spoke 3 languages fluently, that she could read and write better than some adults in town, that she had dreams of becoming a teacher someday. Mrs. Patterson, working beside her to prepare sage poultices, found herself saying, "I'm sorry, child, for the things I said, the way I treated you. I was afraid." "Fear is natural," Ayanna replied without judgment. "My people were afraid too when the white settlers first came. Fear only becomes dangerous when we let it control our actions. Instead of our caution, by evening, they had prepared enough medicine for the entire town." Ayanna insisted on going from house to house with Dr. Reynolds, personally administering the treatments and teaching families how to care for their sick loved ones. At the Lawson place, she knelt beside 70-year-old Billy Lawson, who had been burning with fever for 3 days. She gave him willow bark tea and placed cool sage compresses on his forehead, singing softly an Apache healing song her grandmother had taught her by morning. Billy's fever had broken. Word spread quickly through Clearwater. By the end of the week, every patient treated with Ayanna's medicines had either recovered completely or shown dramatic improvement. Not a single person had died since the treatments began. The transformation in the town's attitude was as dramatic as the medical recoveries. The same people who had threatened to drive Ayanna away now brought her gifts: fresh bread, warm clothing, handmade toys. Children who had been forbidden to go near her now followed her down the street like she was the Pied Piper. Frank Dalton was among the last to make his peace. He found Jake and Ayanna at the general store, where Mrs. Henderson was pressing a new winter coat into the girl's hands and refusing to accept payment. "Morrison," he said stiffly, his hat in his hands, "I owe you an apology, both of you." Jake studied the man who had been his most vocal opponent. "We all make mistakes, Frank." Like this one, Dalton looked directly at Ayanna. "Miss Ayanna Micera was among the children you helped save. I don't reckon I can ever make up for the things I said, the things I did, but if there's ever anything you need, anything at all, you just ask." Ayanna smiled, the same small, tentative smile Jake had first seen in the general store, but stronger now, more confident. "Thank you, Mr. Dalton. All I ever wanted was to belong somewhere, to have people who would be glad to see me when I came home." "Well," Dalton said, his voice gruff with emotion, "I reckon you've got that now." 1 month later, as the first snows of winter dusted the desert peaks, Jake stood on his newly rebuilt porch and watched Ayanna walk up the path from town. She was surrounded by other children, white, Mexican, Apache, all the different faces that made up the changing frontier, all of them chattering excitedly about the day's lessons at the school where she had enrolled. She had been right that first day in the store, her name did mean eternal blossom. But Jake had learned that some blossoms needed time, patience, and the right conditions to truly flourish. As she reached the porch, her arms full of books and her face bright with the joy of belonging, Jake Morrison realized that for the first time in his adult life, he was no longer running from his past. He was home. And so was she. "How was school today, little one?" he asked, the same question he'd asked every day for the past month. "Perfect," she replied, the same answer she gave every day. Then, with the wisdom that had saved a town and healed hearts that had been closed by fear, she added, "Tomorrow will be even better." As the desert wind carried the scent of snow and new beginnings, a lonely cowboy and an Apache girl sat on their porch and planned their tomorrows together. no longer strangers in a hostile world, but family in the truest sense of the word. The town of Clearwater had learned something precious from the girl they had tried to drive away: that courage comes in many forms, that healing requires both medicine and compassion, and that sometimes the very person you're most afraid of is exactly the person you most need to save you in years to come. When children asked about the winter, when cholera threatened to destroy their town, the old-timers would tell them about Iana Morrison, the Apache girl who saved Clearwater with wisdom, courage, and a heart big enough to forgive even those who had wished her harm. And every time they told the story, they remembered that the greatest gifts often come from the most unexpected places, wrapped in packages we might not recognize until we learn to see with our hearts instead of our fears.